You know what's wild? We think we know everything about our favorite celebrities, but sometimes they drop a bomb that completely changes how we see their entire journey. And Lewis Tomlinson just did exactly that. I'm talking about a revelation so raw, so brutally honest, that it's going to make you rethink everything you thought you knew about One Direction's breakup. But here's the thing that nobody's talking about yet, and trust me, by the end of this, you're going to see why this matters way more than you think. So picture this. It's October 9th, and Lewis sits down for the Diary of a CEO podcast. Now, you might be thinking, okay, another celebrity interview, what's new? But hold on, because what he reveals about that final meeting with the boys is something we've never heard before, and honestly, it's going to hit you right in the feels. See, we all remember when One Direction announced their hiatus back in 2016, right? The internet basically broke. Millions of fans were devastated. But what we didn't know, what nobody told us, was what actually happened in that room when the five of them sat down together. And let me tell you, when Lewis describes it, you can literally feel the heartbreak through the screen. Here's where it gets intense. Lewis says the room felt cold that day, not just temperature-wise, but like emotionally cold. Imagine being with four guys you've spent every single day with for years, people who became your brothers, your family, your entire world. You've traveled the globe together, performed for millions, shared hotel rooms, tour buses, inside jokes, everything. And suddenly, you're all sitting in this room, and it feels completely different. That's what Lewis experienced. He talks about seeing the same faces he'd seen every single day before, but the energy was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. There was this emptiness in the air. And you want to know the worst part? They all knew. Every single one of them knew where the conversation was heading before anyone even said a word. Now here's what gets me about this whole thing, and this is where Lewis really opens up in a way that's going to surprise you. He says it crushed him, but not just crushed him in a casual way, he says it absolutely crushed him. He was devastated. And think about what that means for a second. This is a guy who's been in the spotlight since he was basically a teenager. Someone who's had to maintain this image, stay strong for the fans, keep pushing forward no matter what. But in that moment, sitting in that cold room with his bandmates, he felt like everything was falling apart. He literally thought to himself, is this the beginning of the end of the band? And spoiler alert, it was. But here's the question nobody's asking yet, and I promise we're going to get to this. Why did it affect Lewis so differently than we thought? Let me paint you a fuller picture here, because context matters, and this is where things start to make sense in a way that's actually kind of heartbreaking. One Direction wasn't just a band. For Lewis, for all of them really, it was their entire identity. They were put together on X Factor back in 2010. 5 random guys who didn't even know each other became one of the biggest boy bands in history. We're talking about sold-out stadiums, #1 albums, fans screaming their names in every country imaginable. That's not just a job, that's your whole life, that's your family, that's everything you know. So when you're sitting in that room, knowing it's about to end, you're not just losing a band, you're losing your entire world as you know it. But wait, because here's where Lewis drops another emotional bomb that nobody saw coming, and this is going to change how you understand the whole situation. The hiatus was announced in 2016, and at first everyone thought, okay, it's just a break, they'll come back. But then it became permanent that same year, and Lewis reveals something incredibly vulnerable here. He says he had a hard time mourning that chapter of his career ending. Now think about that phrase for a second. He had a hard time mourning it. What does that even mean? Well, Lewis explains it in a way that's so honest, it's almost painful to hear. He says it wasn't until after everything happened that he actually processed all his feelings. In the moment, he couldn't even comprehend what was happening. But later, when it all sunk in, he realized what he was going through. He was grieving, straight up grieving, like someone died. He was grieving the band. And honestly, when you think about it, that makes total sense, doesn't it? Grief isn't just about losing a person. It's about losing anything that was a huge part of your life. Your identity, your purpose, your daily routine, everything. And for Lewis, losing One Direction was exactly that kind of loss. Here's what makes this revelation even more powerful, and stick with me because this is where we really start to understand the bigger picture. One Direction has always been seen as one of the more outspoken members of One Direction. He's the guy who's been vocal about wanting the band to continue, about his loyalty to the group, about how much it meant to him. So when he talks about being crushed and devastated, it hits differently than if any other member said it. This wasn't just a business decision for him. This wasn't just, oh well, time to move on to solo careers. This was genuinely traumatic. And the way he describes that grief, that mourning process, it shows us a side of celebrity life that we don't usually see. You know what's interesting though? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot while processing all this information. We as fans, we felt the loss too, right? When One Direction went on hiatus, millions of people around the world were heartbroken. Social media was flooded with tears and tributes. But we moved on eventually. We started following their solo careers, streaming their individual albums, supporting them separately. But for Lewis, for the actual members of the band, the grief was deeper, more personal, more permanent in a way. Because they didn't just lose a band they loved, they lost a brotherhood, a daily connection with people who understood exactly what they were going through because they were going through it together. And here's the part that really gets to me, and I think this is crucial to understanding why Lewis is opening up about this now. When he talks about that cold room, that emptiness, that collective knowing where things were heading, he's describing a shared trauma. All five of them were in that room together, experiencing the same devastating moment, but probably all processing it differently. Zayn had already left the group a year earlier in 2015, which probably added this extra layer of tension and sadness to the whole situation. Niall, Harry, and Liam were also there, probably feeling their own versions of what Lewis felt. But Lewis is the one now, years later, talking about it in such raw terms. Let me ask you something, though, because this is where it gets really thought-provoking. Why is Lewis being so vulnerable about this now? It's been years since the split. He's had a successful solo career, he's released albums, toured, built his own identity outside of One Direction, so why bring up these painful memories? And I think the answer is actually pretty beautiful. I think Lewis has finally reached a point where he's processed that grief enough to talk about it honestly. He's not trying to maintain an image anymore. He's not worried about seeming weak or dramatic. He's just being real about what that experience was like for him. And in a world where celebrities are constantly curated and filtered, that kind of honesty is incredibly rare and valuable. Here's another layer to this that I find fascinating, and this connects to something bigger about how we view celebrity breakups in general. When a band splits up, we tend to focus on the drama, right? We want to know if there was beef, if someone was difficult to work with, if there were creative differences. We turn it into a story with villains and heroes. But what Lewis is showing us is that sometimes the real story is just sadness, just grief, just the heartbreaking reality of watching something you love come to an end, even if it's the right decision. There doesn't have to be drama for something to be devastating. Think about the metaphor Lewis tries to find when describing that room. He says he's looking for the right metaphor but can't quite land on one. And honestly, that struggle to find words says everything, doesn't it? Some experiences are so emotionally complex that language fails us. How do you describe sitting in a room with your brothers, all of you knowing you're about to end something massive, something that defined your entire young adult life, something that connected you to millions of people around the world? There's no perfect metaphor for that. It just is what it is. Devastating, crushing, empty. But here's where I want to shift gears for a second and talk about what this means for the fans, because I think Lewis's honesty actually gives us something important. For years, Directioners have held on to hope that One Direction might reunite. Every birthday, every anniversary, every time the guys interact on social media, fans analyze it for signs of a reunion. And while Lewis's words are sad, they're also clarifying. They help us understand that the split wasn't casual or temporary. It was real. It was painful. It changed all of them. And maybe that understanding, as hard as it is, actually helps with closure. Maybe knowing that Lewis grieved the band helps fans feel less alone in their own grief about it. Let me bring this all together now, because I think there's a bigger lesson here that goes beyond just one direction. Lewis Tomlinson's willingness to talk about grief, devastation, and emotional processing is actually revolutionary in a way. We live in a culture that tells men, especially, to move on quickly, to not dwell on emotions, to focus on the next thing. But Lewis is saying, no, actually, I was crushed. I grieved. I had to